As an orphan born to a simple hunter and his common folk wife, the only thing Sara received from them was her name. Her first name. Since neither were of noble birth, they weren't so fortunate as to be able to offer anything more. Especially not a last name, since those were most often a privilege only nobility possessed. That didn't really matter though, since for the first 10 years of her life, Sara was happy. In a small village right at the heart of Asura, close to the western edge of the Millbots region, Sara had grown up helping her parents. It was one fateful day when she was 10 years old, though, that a massive horde of monsters would attack and take them away from her. They had lost their lives to an issue the liege lord of her region should have handled. But rather than that lord send his knights and assist immediately, it was instead parties of adventurers that would show up a whole lot later. One of which consisted of Suzanne and Timothy, and another with Mimir and Patrice. They weren't at all acquainted at the time, but when the battle was done and dead accounted for, each pair were the only 2 members remaining from their respective parties. It was a hard-fought clash in which those who survived joined to create their own party together, resulting in the formation of Counter Arrow. Now, back then they were only a D-rank party, but with Sara's help and the constant in and out of other members, it was only a matter of time until they reached the B rank, after which we know there weren't too many quests remaining for them, at least not here in the Asura region. So, with no choice but to go somewhere else, the party decided that heading up north was best, bringing us to Sara's fateful meeting with that depressed magician. When she first heard that he was a Grey Rat, her initial thoughts went straight to the noble who'd ruled over her village, the Notos Grey Rat that controlled the entirety of the Millbots region, yet failed to protect its people when they needed him most. So, without Rudy having even done anything yet, right from the get-go his name was associated with the very person who'd caused the death of her parents. His face even resembled that of the crafty-looking noble who'd once come to visit almost a decade ago. That said, it wasn't only the fact he was a Grey Rat that made her dislike him, since the last name itself was actually quite common. No, it was more so the fact that he even possessed a last name. Since that was a clear indication of noble upbringing, to her this Rudeus Grey Rat was obviously a rich kid. He was this stuck-up noble who'd gotten fed up with his life of riches, then decided to leave it all in hopes of playing the adventurer. His robe and messy hair may have been an attempt to hide that, but the expensive staff he carried dictated otherwise. Not to mention his gloomy look, which practically screamed "I'm running away." It was a common occurrence that Sara was all too familiar with, one she truly despised all the way down to her very core. She couldn't understand what it was that compelled these kids to want to leave behind their easy ride through life, but it was their half-hearted intent to follow through on doing so that made a mockery out of the very profession of adventuring. I mean, these kids would glorify fighting monsters and exploring labyrinths, but as soon as they were faced with any real danger, more times than not they would always run. They would never truly fight like their life depended on it, because at the end of the day they always had somewhere comfy to go back home to. It was this selfish approach to adventuring that always put the real adventurers in danger. There did exist the few whose talent allowed them to become adventurers for real, but out of the many years Sara's been adventuring for, she'd never come across anyone who'd stuck with it. At most, they'd only ever do a couple jobs. So, it was that disregard for those who had no choice but to adventure, and their ideology that it was all just a game, that made Sara hate those kids who treated it as such. She hated the idea of them dragging real adventurers into situations where they could potentially lose their livelihood. She hated how it was always just this brief experiment for them. So, as she pegged Rudy to be another one of those kids, her already shallow opinion of him went even lower. So much so that when Rudy stated he was looking for his mother, she immediately believed it to be a lie. To her, she felt he was just trying to seem special. That being the case, when it came time for Rudy to join their party, Sara felt it best to keep his involvement to a minimum. Mainly because if there ever came a time when things looked dire, Sara was certain Rudy would run just like all the other half-hearted adventurers. It was when that time never came with the Lester Grizzlies, though, that Sara started to think that perhaps she underestimated him. She definitely still hated him because he was an aristocrat, but perhaps her initial opinion on him may have been a little bit harsh. Publicly, she still believed Rudy was lying about his mother, but deep down she knew everything he said was true. Her first job with him made her certain of it. She didn't like the fact that he'd kept his true powers hidden, but the truth of the matter was that Rudeus had saved them. So, no matter how much she still wanted to call Rudy a fraud, deep in her heart she was fully aware that he wasn't. There was just something about him that she still couldn't tolerate though, and it was way too humiliating to accept that one of those rich kids she hated had saved her. It was all incredibly frustrating, but the way Sara lived with it was by downplaying the severity of it all. She told herself that because the challenge wasn't that hard for him, the next time he really was in danger, that's when she'd see him run. She was certain that Rudy was still the character she was making him out to be. Fast forward to after their encounter with the snowdrakes, and once again Rudy had proved her wrong. Combine that with the introduction of a person she hated even more than Rudeus, and her impressions of this supposed rich kid had slightly improved a bit. You see, it was after Soul Dad had insulted both Timothy and Rudy that Sara was furious because of just how wrong he was. She was surprised to find that she was taking Rudy's side for once. For a kid she thought she was supposed to hate, it came as quite the shock when she found herself thinking about just how bravely he fought for them. It made her think that perhaps she didn't hate him. Of course, that made zero sense at all to her, so Sara believed it was just because she must have hated Soldat more. Since Soldat was clearly the worst of two evils, it was only natural she'd take the side of the lesser. I mean, there was a whole list of things Sara came up with that made Rudy better than him. Such a list didn't seem right considering Rudy was born a noble, but out of the months she'd spent getting acquainted with him, Rudy certainly didn't act like one. It was extremely confusing since she'd convinced herself that she was supposed to hate them. They were, after all, the very reason her parents died, and she wasn't just about to forget the overwhelming despair of all that. But unlike the Grey Rat Noble whose duty it was to protect her back then, the Grey Rat Noble here actually protected her now, all without any duty whatsoever. He wasn't even a member of her party. But not only did he not run away when the situation looked tough, he even stayed behind to ensure everyone else was safe. It was an act of bravery that truly resonated with Sara. So much so that when she looked back to find Rudy fighting on his own, she was the first to run back and try and save him. This was yet another shock to Sara, since if she did actually hate him the way that she thought she was supposed to, then she would have had no problem leaving him behind back there. There was a clear shift in her perception that was taking place now. No matter how much she knew she loathed nobility, she just couldn't find herself hating Rudy anymore. And it was her inability to comprehend such a massive change in her core beliefs that once again made her so incredibly frustrated. The way she chose to justify it this time was by saying that she only disliked Rudy now. So while she no longer hates him the way that she thought she did, she definitely didn't like him. A crucial distinction she needed to make in order to help her sleep at night. Fast forward once more to after she was rescued, and that would be the trigger for the two to become a whole lot closer now. The two would share stories from their childhood, and Sara would finally explain why she'd been so cold to him for the first 6 months. Yes, the Grey Rats were the ones responsible for the death of her parents, but Rudeus definitely wasn't one of those Grey Rats. Through hard work and numerous acts of bravery, Rudeus had circumvented her belief that even the children of nobles would grow up to commit the same crimes as their parents. She definitely still hated nobility in general, but Rudy was an exception she'd become quite fond of now. So what started off as a rich kid she couldn't even stand the sight of, turned into a person that wasn't so bad after the first job, then a respectable adventurer after the second. It was from there that her feelings began to change, and with it the core beliefs that every noble was evil. It didn't matter how much she would try to deny it, because nothing would stop her from realizing that Rudeus was different. And it was after that whole endeavor with the Treant, along with the very fact he'd saved her life, that Sara would finally realize it wasn't hatred at all in her heart. No, the feelings that made her so frustrated night after night was in fact a genuine affection to a person she'd fallen for. As soon as she'd come to that realization, Sara didn't hesitate to go out and act on it. She began to invite him to more and more outings and took those as opportunities to get to know him better. Then the more and more they talked, the more she found her affection was growing for him, all the way to the point that she was ready to commit to him. The thing is, because she was too embarrassed to tell him her feelings directly, Sara decided she would instead sleep with him first. She would use her life debt as a pretext to bed him, then go and tell him her feelings after. When that time came and Rudy's lack of arousal became apparent though, the whole thing was just a massive slap in the face for her. She was in complete and utter shock by the fact his body wasn't attracted to hers. Had she watched Rudy's reactions a bit more closely though, then she would have easily noticed that he was in just as much shock as she was. But because this was her first time and she was anxious too, it took all she had to salvage her pride then just get out of there. after which she would spend the entire night crying. Now, this next part is spoilers for what's to come in episode 4, but for the sake of finishing Sara's story to completion, we're just gonna go ahead and talk about it now. So, if you don't want to know what happened after Sara slapped Rudeus, then feel free to click off the video now. It was the day after the whole debacle in bed that Sara would compose herself and seek out Rudy. She'd heard he'd wandered off with Soldat, which was a more than worrying situation since the two weren't exactly friends or anything. When she found them you-know-where talking about you-know-what, every ounce of affection she still felt for him instantly turned to loathing. She was so overcome by shock and devastation that she was blinded to any clue which suggested this wasn't what she thought it was. Had she been a bit older and a bit more mature, then maybe she would have been able to see that something was off. But because Sara was still this 16-year-old girl, everything she saw in the moment she treated as fact. To her, Rudy had spent the night with Soldat, sleeping with women that wasn't her, drinking the same alcohol he refused to drink with Counter Arrow, then recounting just how revolting Sara's body was to him. That was the story Sara came up with, and it was the story she would stick with until convinced otherwise. It wasn't until some time later that Suzanne would go ahead and share her own impressions of the situation. To her, something was very clearly off about Rudy. She wasn't sure what it was, but the boy she saw back there definitely wasn't the Rudeus that she knew. So, knowing the dangers of coming to assumptions too quickly, Suzanne spoke from experience when she suggested it may just be a misunderstanding. Of course, Sara was convinced Rudy had just been lying the past 6 months, but after Timothy suggested it was a misunderstanding too, Sara finally resolved herself to determining the truth. She would return to town, question Rudy, then apologize if she did in fact jump to conclusions. When she returned and found he'd left, the only person she could talk to instead was Elise. A conversation that started out a bit hostile, but not from the person that you would expect. Since Elise knew the full context of the situation, she had recounted Rudy's story all while placing the entire blame on Sara. It was important she understand exactly the type of corner she had backed Rudy into. So, once all was said and done, Elise had left Sara with something to think about. If she wasn't even able to realize how much she'd hurt him, then she definitely wasn't ready to be his partner. It was a statement that weighed heavy on her even after. Reason being that, in addition to the pain Rudy had caused her earlier, she now had to bear the weight of the pain that she caused him. They were feelings of remorse and regret that would haunt her the entire night. Suzanne did suggest that they should go after him, but Sara wasn't so brave as to be able to confront him like that. She was afraid that he wouldn't listen, scared he would push her away after what she'd done to him. So, after a long night sobbing and coming to terms with everything that had happened, Sara simply accepted Rudy's silent departure as a sign of rejection. She knew now that the brief love they shared was over. If there did ever come a time where the two could meet again though, Sara felt that she would like to apologize. A true and sincere one that would properly convey her feelings this time. But yeah, that's the story of Sara. Another tragic tale of misunderstanding. I'll talk more about it in the cut content for episode 3, but the way her relationship ended has so many fascinating parallels with the way that Rudy's ended. Like, Rudy saved her because he didn't want anyone to feel abandoned the same way Eris abandoned him, yet in the end he just ended up doing exactly that anyway. It's like a vicious cycle in which misunderstanding lies at the center of it. In any case, let me know what you thought about Sara in the comments. I'd love to see how you all perceived her story. Also, if you want more Mushoku Tensei content like this, then be sure to like and subscribe since I upload them every week. I also stream discussions every Sunday on Twitch. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!